Hello, hello, beautiful soul. Welcome to this special episode on how psychedelic experiences have helped me to reclaim my power and sovereignty in life. Welcome. It's so good to have you tuned in and dialed in. If you didn't know me already, I am Dr. Andrea Pennington. I am an integrative physician, acupuncturist, meditation teacher, and the author of several best-selling books, including The Real Self-Love Handbook and The Top 10 Traits of Highly Resilient People. I am super excited to kick off a series of videos about psychedelics. Maybe you've heard, I am actually in preparation to launch psychedelic retreats. It's not what you think, though. As I get my certification to become a psychedelic assisted therapy provider, there are certain rules and regulations which we'll get into in this series. And I want you to know that to have a psychedelic experience, you don't necessarily need to take a drug or a substance, all right? So I'm curious to know what you already know about psychedelics and what your questions may be. Feel free to type them into the chat. And if you're watching on the replay, type in hashtag replay and still leave your questions and I will certainly answer them. So as we start to explore what psychedelics are and what they are not, I first and foremost have to really acknowledge our ancestors. Because I, as a scientist and a physician, I'm hearing about all this amazing research going on with EEGs and functional MRIs and companies working in the lab to create synthetic molecules to create psychedelic experiences. All of that is all well and good. But the reality is our ancestors have carried the wisdom of how to use plants, fungi, and even medicines from toads for thousands of years. So psychedelic medicine is not new at all. We really do have to honor our ancestors, the Black, Indigenous, and people of color from the Americas, from various regions on the continent of Africa, in China and Tibet. So these substances are not new. Yes, there is a renaissance of research going on because people are realizing that they are incredibly effective. All right, so gotta love it when your daughter calls you in the middle of a live. So first and foremost, I am coming out about my experiences with psychedelics, which actually started back in the early 2000s. The reason I'm coming out now and sharing more about my personal experiences and becoming a certified provider is because Black and brown people have a reluctance and a skepticism around mental health in general, and definitely around psychedelics. When I was introduced to psychedelics, I didn't know other people like me. You know, being a woman of color, brought up by an immigrant to the United States, there weren't a lot of people like me into these sorts of things. And of course, I was born in 1970. So all I heard was drugs are bad, it's gonna fry you, it's gonna last forever, and you'll never get out of it. But that's actually been reversed. My thinking has been brought into the mainstream, and it's why I'm coming out, because in particular, I want more people of color to know that these medicines can be incredibly powerful. They're not for everyone. There are many contraindications, both psychological and physiological. And you need to know what you're actually getting, which is why I advocate for engaging in these ceremonies in a safe setting with people that you trust, and being able to have someone who relates to your life as a woman of color. I get that. So providing ceremony opportunities for people of color is something that I'm doing this year and moving forward. So I'm going to do special videos about each of these psychedelic substances and more of the science behind them, and why one might be a better choice for you than another, and why some are completely going to be off the table for you, depending on your psychology or your cardiovascular status. But I thought I would open up to your questions and share some of my experiences. Now, my first psychedelic experience was when I had my near-death experience in 2005. So an NDE as a psychedelic experience? Well, this begs the question, what is a psychedelic? And what is a psychedelic experience? Now, if we look at the people who have promoted this term, psyche means the mind. Our psyche is the mind. Delun was the root word for reveal, to expose. So exposing the mind, that is what a psychedelic is. It is mind revealing. Some people say it's mind manifesting. And so when one has a psychedelic experience, they're having an expanded experience of their mind. Now, not all psychedelic experiences involve substances, and some psychedelic experiences do not include crazy hallucinations. So, can you have a psychedelic experience without taking a substance? Absolutely. We know that for, again, millennia, people have been able to get into expanded states of consciousness through doing breath work, through chanting, through ecstatic dance and whirling, certain forms of prayer, and also just having a deep existential crisis can lead some people to leave and go into an expanded state of consciousness. And that's exactly what happened in my case. In 2005, I was living in the United States. I was at what some would call the height of my career in medicine and TV and books and all of that stuff. But inside, I was suffering. I know it sounds like a cliche to have all the outer trappings of success, but inwardly feeling unfulfilled. And as I shared in my TED Talks, I happened to be on the Riviera, visiting the Mediterranean, when I had this out-of-body experience. And for me, the catalyst for that was a complete and utter surrender. I had already made a pact with my higher self that I would not end my life. I admit that there were years in my in my adolescence where I did have suicidal ideation. And I made a commitment when I heard a voice, and no, I am not schizophrenic, but I heard a voice tell me that, Andrea, you're actually pretty much awake and you're gonna be able to get past this. If you take your life, this is what this voice said, if you take your life, you might come back as some lower form. And I hadn't heard of Hindus or Buddhists that believed in reincarnation at that point in my life, living in Aurora, Colorado. But I agreed to not end my life. So again, in 2005, I was here in France. I happened to be singing in this beautiful chic nightclub in Saint-Tropez. And in that moment of singing and just feeling like I was one with all, one with the audience, one with the music, I had this peak experience of bliss and just joy. And then I got back to my hotel and I realized, wow, I have to return to America and go back into this box of conformity that was literally strangling me. And it was then that I cried out to God to take my life. And I flung myself onto the bed, and I was shaking and trembling, and I felt myself melt into the bed. And then there was this blinding light, and I felt myself being drawn into the light. And I thought God was answering my prayer because I felt complete peace. I felt no fear. I felt as though I was being drawn into the hereafter. And when I got to the other side, I saw a complete review of my entire life in a split second. And I saw how each of the decisions that I had made led me to that moment of being depressed. Now, here's where we talk about the personal power. When I was in that state, in that beyond, I had this instant awareness that I had choice. I mean, does that sound lame to you? Like, duh, of course we have choice. But in that vision, I saw all of the choices that I made since being a baby. And we don't typically think of infants as having this conscious volition. And I remember this essence or this being next to me. And I sort of said, you're saying that I have choice in life? Well, if I can choose, then I'll just choose differently. And as soon as I said that, a whole new vision unfolded. And I saw me living in France and walking hand in hand with a child and healing with my hands and singing professionally. And a lot of that was like, huh? How am I going to have a baby? I was 34 and single. Healing with my hands? What? I'm going to be a woo-woo doctor? And the singing professionally? Well, that part I loved. And so I said yes. And I instantly returned back into my body. And that dark cloud of depression that I'd had since childhood was gone. That ecstatic experience, that coming through the dark night of the soul, I really call it the dark night of the ego, because it was my ego that surrendered and my soul rose and came forward. So that near-death experience was a psychedelic experience. It was a mind-revealing experience. And there have been several since then that have further emboldened me to have this sort of power, personal sovereignty. So I'm going to check your comments and see if this is resonating with you. So yes, Lisa, you are welcome. I'm happy to share. And Karan, good to have you here. Sandra D asks, were you afraid to try psychedelics the first time? And how long did the altered state last? Yes, Sandra D, good to have you here. Well, my first formal introduction to having someone facilitate a psychedelic experience was actually in 2008 when I attended a workshop in Sedona, Arizona, and it was a trance dance workshop. It was also the first time I encountered a Black shaman, and he introduced us into breath work and trance dance and revealed to us how so many cultures go through various rites of passage. So whether that's going out into the jungle, ingesting a substance, singing, chanting, whatever the ritual or ceremony is, there's so many cultures that do this for people at various points in their life, such as getting into puberty and when one gets married and when one has a child or when one is retiring or at death. And so it was fascinating to me because what it showed me is that exactly what I learned in my NDE is we come into this world with full sovereignty. We have the power to choose who and what we will be in life. The challenge is that for most of us, we didn't grow up as indigenous people who had, this tribe to nurture for infants. We have concrete and skyscrapers and nannies, and we have this socialized system that basically separates us from our true nature. And our true nature is actually pure, it's whole, it's enlightened, and it's over these lifetimes that we accumulate the gunk, the karmic imprints that disconnect us from our true self and our true state of being, that purity. And so that socialization process, as I was learning in this trance dance workshop, is what we Westerners kind of need to get smacked out of us, so that we could reconnect to that power. So the first thing that after he had worked with us in this session, he told me about ayahuasca. And ayahuasca is actually a combination of two plants, the Banisterius caapi, which is a vine, and another plant where you take the leaves and the bark and they blend them, cook them in water and make it into a very thick molasses-like tea. Tastes nothing like tea. But the shaman was telling us how he was leading ayahuasca ceremonies in the jungle in Hawaii, where people had to like dig a hole to like puke into. And I'm like, why would I want to go into the scary jungle and be sick, throwing up, diarrhea, and then take a hallucinogen? No, thank you. So it wasn't actually until 2017. So almost a decade had passed, and I'd learned so much more about this magical concoction known as ayahuasca to many of the tribes in South America. There's also another Amazonian brew called yahe, same key substance, that being that it is going to release DMT. And DMT, dimethyltryptamine, is a substance that our brains create on our own. Some people talk about the DMT orgasm. We have this capability to create it. And most importantly, our brains are wired for these ecstatic experiences. Now, to answer your question, Sandra, with ayahuasca, it lasts for several hours. So you might be sitting in ceremony for 6 to 8 hours or longer. And as you know, I recently sat in ceremony in Costa Rica, where ayahuasca is completely legal. My first session was in Peru, again, completely legal. I do not advocate for the purchase or sitting with substances that are illegal. It's not what I recommend at this point in my life as a physician, for safety reasons and legal reasons. But my first experience was in Peru with a beautiful ayahuasquera who had trained. She comes from a long line of ayahuasqueras and was trained in Peru. And it lasted about 8 hours. And around 4 a.m, I went back to my room, slept as much as I could, and then went about the rest of my retreat there. I was afraid only because I had heard so many bad stories. And I'll do this substance by substance. So you asked about my first major one. The first major one was ayahuasca. And I was scared because I'd heard people would have these crazy hallucinations about demons and all sorts of scary stuff. And knowing what's in my subconscious mind and how much I watched horror movies as a teenager, I'm like, I don't know. I don't want to let the demons out of my subconscious. But my first experience was actually very beautiful. The medicine was actually very kind to me, or my psyche was kind to me. And it was one of the beautiful confirmation experiences for me. It confirmed so much about my place in life. So that was my first. All right. So Ruth asks, do you think it is risky to try this alone? Where would be a good source to find someone suitable to work with, like psilocybin? How long would the microdose be to continue working, i.e. how long to schedule? Well, each substance is different. I would certainly never recommend doing ayahuasca without a qualified, legit, not a weekend or someone who studied for a few months to become a shaman. That's my bias. And I know there are many people working in the underground who believe differently, but this is from my personal experience and my professional experience as a physician. I would say, don't do ayahuasca on your own. That's just not. So psilocybin mushrooms, which is another one of our classic psychedelics, magic mushrooms. So psilocybin is the active ingredient in certain mushrooms that gets broken down into something called psilocin, and that is what activates some of these serotonin receptors and leads to the psychedelic experience, which includes hallucinations. So ayahuasca and psilocybin also create sort of perceptual changes, the way we see things, colors, and feeling. Like you can feel color, if you can imagine that. I would say that first and foremost, with psilocybin, it depends on what country you're in. I know that you're in the UK, I think. So you would have to check with your local laws. So typically, for most countries, psilocybin is not legal. So I wouldn't recommend doing it on your own. I would recommend that you go somewhere where you can sit in ceremony. Now, we are at an age now where there are clinical trials, where many countries have the legal right to run trials. Many of these are FDA-approved trials in Canada and the United States and in England. I've seen studies in Switzerland, in Holland, and in Spain. And in those cases, and what's emerging out of that research is that people are suggesting there are at least 2 people that are there to care for the person who is undergoing the psilocybin journey. And as I am in the IPI training, which is the Integrative Psychiatry Institute training, in partnership with MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, that's a mouthful, I will be certified to provide psychedelic-assisted therapy with psilocybin and MDMA when they become FDA approved, and of course ketamine. Ketamine is another substance. It is not a classical psychedelic. It's an anesthetic that has dissociative properties and can lead to quite a psychedelic experience. So, okay, that was a long answer to your question. Ruth, your next piece of the question was, how long would the microdose be? Well, microdosing is a very interesting subject with psychedelic research going on right now. And in the past, people have said you're taking a sub-perceptual dose, meaning you wouldn't have hallucinations. And in fact, what we're seeing is where you're taking a tenth of what would be considered a recreational dose, just taking a tenth of it, some people were saying, no, I don't have any hallucinations, but I am perceiving colors look richer and textures feel, more tactile. So a microdose, there are a couple of different protocols out there that you can research. Some people talk about this Paul Stamets protocol and the Fadiman protocol, each of which have been slightly modified over time. But a microdose doesn't really have a rapid onset or a perceptual onset. If you are doing something, then you're feeling it, then that's not a microdose. So how would you find someone? I would go online if you wanted to connect with other citizens who are trying microdosing. The only real way that you can safely have mushrooms is to grow them yourself. Pure and simple. Check the laws in your country to see, and your state, if you're in the United States, to see if it's legal for you to grow and have your own mushrooms. As long as you're not selling them, don't go on the web. And certainly, now that we've had this conversation, if you start seeing pop-up ads for people trying to sell you substances, do not go there. Quite often they are scams. Okay. All right, let me get back to the questions here. So Mimi, she says, thank you for sharing. It's definitely not for everyone, but very insightful for you. The hard part is integrating what you experienced into your life. Yes, Mimi, it is. And that's really why I wanted to share this, and it's why I'm now, sitting with people to do the psychedelic integration. Because without it, it's just a crazy trip. If you don't either have a community that you can share, there are lots of integration circles, or you have a therapist or a coach who is psychedelic aware or psychedelic trained or experienced for themselves, then sometimes you don't have a way to integrate the insights or capture them before they dissipate into the ether. And it is a critical part of making this a therapeutic activity, and rather than just a fun and funny trip like going to Burning Man or raves. And again, if we just go back to the ancestral lineages that have used these plants and fungi, and I mentioned the toad, which I have not yet experienced, there are always integrations. Like, people are taking what they learn and they're sharing it with their elders, and then they're living it. And for me, that's the most important thing about having one of these psychedelic experiences. For me, that first near-death experience, I realized that I had conscious choice, and that we are each pure little droplets of God consciousness, and that it is totally appropriate for me to choose my destiny, not based on the American Medical Association or my mama or my daddy or the media. And so how did I start integrating that into my life? Well, I started doing research, because I had never heard of anyone having an NDE without being flatlined, on an operating table or in a coma or in an accident. So how do we integrate these experiences? As I've started to offer integration coaching for people, it's about, first and foremost, understanding your own psyche. So I would highly recommend, if you were thinking about engaging in a psychedelic experience, even if that's just breath work, and I don't say just breath work, holotropic breath work, my deepest gratitude, deep bow to Stanislav Grof and his late wife, Christina Grof. Stan actually started doing LSD studies before it was illegal. And once it became a Schedule I substance in America, he and his wife, Christina, were able to help people get back into psychedelic states with holotropic breathwork. So you'll see that some of the retreats that I'm offering this year will be helping you get into an expanded state of consciousness with breathwork and not giving you any substances. So it's important that you know your psyche, know your shadow, know the material that might come up, because we've defined psyche as mind, and delun means revealing. When your mind is truly revealed, when you're turning on all the light and you can see what has been hiding in your shadow, that can be very confronting. It can be very uncomfortable. And so you'll often hear people say, if something negative or scary comes up, lean into it. Don't back away, don't run away, don't get scared, lean in. You have everything you need to survive it, if you're doing this, again, in a safe setting and at the right dose for your physiology. And the time that this was made so clear to me was a time where I was in ceremony with two shamans. I had the beautiful soul Whitefire from Iceland and Jose from Peru. And we were sitting in ceremony, and the first night I had just these scenes coming up. And when I first felt the effects of the ayahuasca, I started to see, it's a very visual thing for me, I started to see parts of my life and things that I labeled and judged. And at that moment, I was like, oh my God, Dre, I thought you were so spiritual. Look at all this judgment. And it took me a while to realize that what I was seeing was all of the things I'd ever labeled, past and present. Because sometimes when you're in this psychedelic space, you lose all sense of time. Time doesn't mean the same thing. And so once I realized that, I'm not seeing what me as a judgmental person now, it's like all the things that I've ever labeled. But at first, every time a scene came up that had a negative label, according to me, I would get disgusted. I would feel shame. I would feel guilt. And I was like, no, don't show me this. And I was swiping on a screen. I was like, don't show me that. And then another image would pop up. And I was confronted with this shame. I'm like, all this judgment. And I would try to wipe it away. People will tell you this. If you're in a psychedelic experience and there's something that you are resisting, it's going to make you have what we call a quote unquote difficult trip. There are no bad trips. There are difficult trips. And you can typically gain a lot of awareness from them. In the moment, I was so filled with disgust for myself until I remembered hearing the shaman say, don't resist, surrender. And as soon as I finally allowed an image to come and I'm like, okay, fine, show me what you want me to see about this. I started to relax and I felt myself go almost down an elevator until I got to the basement of my psyche. And I saw this little version of Dre, me, with a clipboard. And she was just sort of tabulating and labeling and categorizing. And I was like, why don't you stop that? All that labeling, all that judgment. It's like so bad. And literally, I looked at myself and was like, I'm just categorizing. I'm not saying any of these things are wrong or bad. And it was only after I could get into integration that I could get out of self-judgment. When I came out of that ceremony, I was like, dang, I am one judgmental. Until sitting and thinking it through and talking it through, I realized, no, that is a part of me that is discerning, and she's just tagging information. It was in those upper levels where it was like, this is bad, stay away from it. This is good, go toward it. And that's what our ego is. The ego is a social construct. It is a construct of the mind that is geared towards survival. And so, of course, we're always labeling and tagging and assessing, is this an experience I want to go toward or stay away from? Will this bring me pain and pleasure and reproduction? Or is it threatening my survival? And what this allowed me to do is this experience allowed me to recognize a little bit about my perfectionism. So I started this conversation by saying that psychedelics have helped me reclaim my personal power. So one of the ways that powerlessness showed up in my life is I had a compulsive need to prove myself. I was always trying to back up anything I said or did with facts and figures and statistics and arguments for my position. And what that led to, besides this exhausting compulsive behavior, it led to perfectionism. It led to me always checking and double checking and quadruple checking my facts and anything I did. And it created so much tension inside of me and misery. And once I could see from this psychedelic experience that like I had just dialed up on that spectrum of labeling and gone into this perfectionistic, and that prompted these behaviors, it was then that I could have a lot more compassion for myself and for those parts. And so there are a lot of us in this space that are really looking at how internal family systems can really help us in psychedelic experiences, because we start to recognize these parts of ourselves. And even someone who was sitting in ceremony, a magic mushroom ceremony, told me that he saw a vision of himself as a little kid. And this was a guy who had never been in psychotherapy and had never heard of inner child work. And he saw this vision of himself as a little boy and just all alone. And he could really connect with how some of his adult behaviors had been started by that childhood experience. And so for me, learning to integrate and recognize that these are just parts of the psyche. They're normal, they're just what we inherit. Yes, we are pure essence and soul. And when we come into a human body, we inherit certain hardware and a tendency towards building up certain software that is actually malware. All right. So that was one of the ways that I was able to break free from perfectionism and reclaim my sense of power to choose. And so if we look into this word sovereign or sovereignty, some of you may have seen the song that I wrote shortly after coming back from 4 ayahuasca ceremonies at Rhythmia in Costa Rica. I came back with so much of this sense of power and sovereignty that I wrote a song called I'm Free. And I looked it up because I was like, why is the word sovereign coming in so strongly? Sovereignty means that we are free from external control. when you are the sovereign in your life, it's as if you are the king or the queen. You have the ultimate authority. You are self-governing. You have autonomy. You have your own personal power to set limits, set boundaries, to make choices and decisions without being overly concerned with what people are going to think, what they're going to say, how it's going to make you look. And for me, that ayahuasca ceremony in November of last year for my birthday, in ceremony, I ended up purging a lot of the fear that I had. I had very specific fears around success and fears around intimate relationships. And Mother Ayahuasca helped me to purge them. And it was funny because as I came out of like the intensity of like knowing, facing my fear, facing what was in my psyche, things from the past, things from my childhood, I was able to direct so much love and compassion to those parts of me that then I was able to purge it out. And by purge, I mean vomiting. Ayahuasca, for most people, makes you vomit. I'm not going to bring up my experience with my dear friend for whom I purged and she didn't. That's a whole nother story. But once I purged out these fears, I then got this sense of power. And as it pertains to love, I remember in my ayahuasca ceremony asking, like, show me what is blocking me from, finding and maintaining a healthy love relationship. And I saw, again, very visual scenes come up. And as I addressed each one and showered love and compassion on the parts of me that were wounded or had faulty thinking, all of that, I then remember reaching and bringing back my power from all the heartbreak, from all the sadness. And it was as if I was bringing light back into my heart and back into my womb and back into my body. And I remember at the end of that ceremony, I was getting up and other people were dancing. I don't usually dance in ceremony because I'm just like, laid out on the mattress. But I remember dancing and I had this like Jay-Z song coming into my head. And it was like, I'm back. Your girl is back. And I literally felt like my power had come back. And in that ceremony, I then saw this vision of the most beautiful love scene, not like sex scene. I mean, like connection with a beloved. And that's a story for another day. Let me get back to your comments. So Karan, you experienced a temazcal ceremony in Mexico, and it opened my mind to so many things, including going deeper into our ancestral traditions. How do you know when choosing someone to work with whether or not they will protect you? Well, I would definitely say take your time to get to know them. I've been very, very blessed and spoiled to have medicine women and medicine men in my circles who I feel very, very safe with. So again, I would just vet them in terms of what is their training and in which lineages, because not every lineage is the same. And ask them, what will you do to keep me safe? So the first thing that anyone should be doing if they're inviting you into ceremony is getting you through an adequate medical check, not like a physical checkup, but they're asking you to fill out a questionnaire and asking you certain questions about your physical and mental health. If they're not doing that, if they're just willing to, hey, just pay the money and come and sit in ceremony, I would say that's not a safe place. You want to have a conversation with them as well and kind of feel the energy. Your body is an antenna. We will pick up energies from other people. And if there's anything that makes you feel unsafe, it's one thing to be unsafe, scared of the medicine, but it's quite another thing if you feel unsafe with a person. Trust your intuition on that. And Karan, if you want some great people, I'm happy to connect you with the beautiful souls that I have worked with in Iceland and of course in Costa Rica. I will be going back to Rhythmia this year, November, for my birthday again. And you can also come to one of my retreats where we will be doing holotropic breath work to help people get into psychedelic states. All right, je vais mieux. Okay, your question. I've been practicing with Psilohuasca. Okay. So a magic combination of psilocybin and ayahuasca, I'm assuming. And I'd like to experience ayahuasca with a guide. I'm in France. Do you know trustworthy guides in Europe? Ideally in France. I do not know anyone here in France, and I don't believe that ayahuasca is legal here. You can find ayahuasca retreats in Holland, and that's not far to go. So there are certainly some there, and if you send me an email, I'm happy to connect you with some people that I know in Holland who might be able to guide you. The people at Synthesis, they're not offering retreats right now because of COVID, but Synthesis, they do ketamine and psilocybin retreats. But in terms of ayahuasca, not here in France that I know of. Karan, another great question. Is marijuana considered psychedelic? So actually there are strains of cannabis that when taken in the right dose can create these mind manifesting or psychedelic experiences. So it may not be what we would consider a classical psychedelic. When we talk about classical psychedelics, we're talking about psychedelics that interact with the serotonin 5-HT2A receptors. And so our classic psychedelics are the indolamines, which are DMT, LSD, and psilocybin, and also the phenylethylamines like mescaline, which, as you know, comes from a cactus. And then the non-traditional psychedelics, certain strains of cannabis in the right amount can create psychedelic experiences. Ketamine is also a non-classical psychedelic. It is an anesthetic that has dissociative properties. It's shorter acting. I, as a pediatrician, knew of ketamine for use in the pediatric population because it's such a safe anesthetic. But unfortunately, it's gotten a bad rap because it does have addictive potential, and people have abused ketamine at parties and raves and done horrible things with it. But there are now people who are able to get treatment for suicidal ideation and treatment-resistant depression with ketamine, whether that's as an IV infusion, an intramuscular injection, or a sublingual. And so I'm looking forward to being able to offer ketamine in some of our workshops and retreats in Georgia later this year. And then MDMA is not really a classical psychedelic. It works on a completely different way. It doesn't necessarily create hallucinations. It's considered an entheogen. It helps us connect with the heart. And I will say that I first experienced MDMA and was like, what is this stuff? It was my first experience with like deep, unconditional love. I just felt nothing but love. And it's what inspired me to start looking at phenylethylamines. And I found this beautiful book by Alexander, or Sasha, as he was affectionately called. Sasha Shulgin wrote a book called PiCAL, which it spells out phenylethylamines I have known and loved. And it was literally a field report and lab report of him synthesizing phenylethylamines, like MDMA, and then taking them himself and noting down everything that happened. So he and his wife, again, deep bow of gratitude for the amazing field work they did to help us with our understanding of MDMA. So, Ruth, any idea how long before you will gain a license for treatment and retreats? So as a physician, I am able to do ketamine sessions, and I actually probably will do it with more of a ceremonial vibe. That's just because of my background with first working with substances. And that will be in the United States because that's where I'm medically licensed. We will be doing breathwork retreats, however, in multiple places around the world where you don't need a license because we're doing breathwork, not any substances. So Ruth also asks, does everyone vomit from ayahuasca? Well, as I intimated before, I vomited for someone and I wasn't even sitting in ceremony. So no, not everyone vomits. So if you remember me telling you that there is this bark or the root of the Banisterius caapi, And the leaves of this viridis plant, that the leaves and the bark are mixed together. And the reason that they're needed together is because one of them contains a substance or an enzyme that will make the DMT available for us. But it's also that enzyme that makes us vomit. Most people do. I was sitting in 4 ceremonies, one of them an all-night-long ceremony with 4 servings of ayahuasca at Rhythmia, and there were some people who didn't vomit. So, as I mentioned, this person shall remain nameless until we do a live together. But there was a couple of years ago, I was here at home, had a nice dinner with my daughter, went to bed, and I woke up in the middle of the night feeling nauseous. And I'm not someone who gets stomach issues. Even when I was pregnant, I only vomited on the day I gave birth. So vomiting is not my thing. It's not my go-to. And I woke up and I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be sick. And sure enough, I vomited. I checked on my daughter because I'm wondering, like, was it something that we ate? You know, we ate the same food. She was peaceful, sleeping in her room. The next day, I got a message from my friend who was sitting in ceremony. She was like, yeah, it's the weirdest thing. I didn't vomit. And I'm like, oh, I knew we had like a really strong soul connection, but I'm like, for real? I'm vomiting for you in ceremony? That's not cool. So no, you don't necessarily have to vomit in ceremony, but if you most likely will. You know, even if it's not the first time, and that's okay, you will eventually purge. So Ruth also says, I've tried conscious connected breath work, but not experienced anything with it. So I'm curious about psychedelics. Yeah, it's really helpful if you have a great facilitator for holotropic breath work or other types of breath work. I mean, it does take a consistent, deep, fast breathing over a consistent period of time. In the holotropic breath work that Stan Grof promotes and created, there's also music. So there's this evocative music that's also helpful in your, laying down so that you can get into these expanded states. But yeah, certainly, maybe psychedelics are for you. So Shaf asks, what retreats am I planning? Well, there are 2 beautiful physician friends of mine who are both trained and certified in certain modalities. So Dr. Jill Stalker in California has already done her certification for ketamine. And so we are getting together to do some ketamine retreats in the United States, in California. And that will allow people to take ketamine, which I mentioned is an anesthetic. It's got a very safe physiologic profile. It does make some people a little bit nauseous, but typically, since it's a medical thing, we'll give you an anti-nausea medicine. And it's a much shorter trip. You're literally, the session might be an hour, 2 at the max. And people will still find this same sort of expansiveness, and they get a lot of revelations. Also with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Corina Fratilla, who's in the Baltimore area. We are partnering up to do some things in the DC and Baltimore area. And I will be going back to Costa Rica. So in early November, before I go to Rhythmia, I will also be doing a retreat with breath work. So you don't have to take any substances. You can come and experience 4-day rituals of ceremony with that. So yes. All right. So Karan, you're waiting for info. Yes. Awesome. Great. Wonderful. So this seems to be the common question here. All right. And Ruth says, the story about my friend reminded you of when you had sympathy pain after chatting to a friend and fainted, landing on your nose. Oh my heavens. Wow. Well, if you are an empath, for any of the empaths out there, just know that some of these psychedelics, if you were already a somewhat open individual and you could tune into other people's energy and frequencies, this will heighten it, including microdosing. Now, again, I happen to live in Europe, and so obtaining truffles from Holland is completely legal. And I did last year start microdosing. And it was very interesting for me to see that a lot of the procrastination, it helped me sort of separate out and see these different parts. So I've talked about internal family systems and how psychedelics just naturally give people access to these different parts, the critic and the inner child and all of these different parts. And what I noticed with microdosing, and again, so some people will take subclinical doses of psilocybin containing mushrooms or truffles. In Holland, they are able to sell truffles and not the fruiting body, which comes up above the ground. But many people will find that they have increased creativity, focus, concentration, their heightened senses. And for me, it was incredible because I could get in the zone and focus, but I could also distinguish different parts of me. And I could sense like, oh, okay, there's this resistance part. And it would allow me to kind of tune in. Because I've been doing so much work in meditation, I know how to access these parts, but it really helped for me. So this is just a little bit of a window into some of the ways that psychedelics have helped me reclaim my sense of power, my sovereignty. I have retired fully my perfectionist. Like, she's gone. She doesn't come back. She's off on a beach in Greece, loving life. I have much easier times in recognizing when my procrastinator part comes up. And I think that that's really useful. One more thing that I'll share that psychedelic experiences have helped me in terms of reclaiming my power. For me, all of my experiences have been very visual. And as you may know, last year, my mother left her body and transitioned. And I sat in ceremony before she died. I was sitting in ceremony with Dr. Jill Stalker and Sol Whitefire in Iceland, and did what we call a heroic dose of magic mushrooms in a very legal and safe setting. And I connected with my mom's spirit. And it was interesting because I was speaking French to her, and we were just like having this conversation in French. And I was like, it was in July, and I was like, just hold on, I'm coming. And sure enough, I was able to get to the United States and spend some time with my mother before she passed. And I really believe that that connection that we had allowed me to communicate with her. And in fact, in the first ayahuasca experience I had in 2017, I also connected with my mom's spirit. And at that point, Karan, I don't know if you're still here. You know Dr. P. She was always very feisty. And I was really struggling back then with seeing my mom lose her cognitive function, her spunk, and her brilliant mind. And it was in that ceremony in 2017 that I just wept. Like, I cried like gut-wrenching tears and really got to grieve the loss of my mom's mind. And in that ceremony, that first ceremony in Peru, I connected with her soul then and just showered her with love and appreciation for all that she transmitted to me. I asked for forgiveness for all the crap I did in my teenage years, and, you know, even in my adult years where I held resentment against her. And that ceremony was really pivotal for me in accepting my mom and my relationship. And then in last year, after she passed, I sat in ceremony with magic mushrooms. And I was shown a scene of me as a tiny baby just after I was born. And I could see a lot of chaos and fear and confusion. And now I know that my parents had tension because 3 years after I was born, they divorced for the second time. And I could see in this vision, in this mushroom ceremony, I could see this sort of dark energy that my mother had been carrying from her own wounds in childhood. Her mother died when my mom was just 10 years old or 11 years old. And my mother was rejected by her father. And she carried these traumatic wounds. She didn't have psychedelics. She didn't even have psychotherapy. she just kind of soldiered on. And as I was in this ceremony, I saw this transmission of some of that darkness to me as a baby. And I saw how I had grown up and felt this sense that it was all my fault. And I have never had any cognitive awareness of like feeling that things are my fault. I know someone here has heard me say, don't apologize, only apologize if you really do something bad. But how some people do say, I'm sorry all the time. I didn't have that habit. I didn't think that, but in this mushroom ceremony and seeing that, I could see how this tiny baby who grew up feeling that somehow everything was all my fault. And in that ceremony, I was able to weep and grieve for all that tiny baby Dre took on, and most importantly, to give it back to my mother so that she could heal it and release it. And it was such a deep ceremony because this was after she had passed away. And I could send her love and compassion and forgiveness because she was an adult child of a dysfunctional family and never got healing. And I could see her leave and go into the light. And I felt so much lighter and so much freer to just accept that, yeah, when things go wrong, it isn't my fault. Like I have this very reflexive fix-it mentality. Like if somebody presents a problem, I feel like I got to be the one to fix it. And I could see the origins in that as I sat in this mushroom ceremony. So those are just a few of the experiences. I don't have time to tell you every little thing that I've learned from psychedelics, but I thought that, specifically this reclaiming of my power to take up space, my right to choose what I'm going to do in my life. I mean, some of you know that I, shortly thereafter came back and shaved more of my head. I saw that in my ayahuasca ceremony. Actually, so did Dr. Jill Stalker when we were at our 5G mushroom experience. She saw me rocking a mohawk months before I shaved my head. But these have been really powerful experiences. And in the last 3 years, I have lost 2 very important people to suicide. And I know for certain that the untreated and mistreated depression that they both suffered with, if I could have offered them an option to experience psychedelics in a safe setting, I believe they would both still be here today. They wouldn't have had to die by suicide. And it's also for that reason that I am committed to sharing, my experiences personally and what I can do professionally, because these really offer a lot more hope than the traditional model of psychotherapy or talk therapy. These actually offer a greater deal of hope than even pharmacology. And I'll do a whole video on the science and all of the research, well, maybe not all of the research, because there have been thousands of studies all the way back, in the 50s from LSD to present time. But I'm really encouraged. I'm encouraged by what psychedelics can do for us in the right set and setting with integration. It can allow us to recover from so many things, from PTSD and depression and anxiety. There have been great studies and new studies coming out with eating disorders, with substance use and alcohol use disorders. So there's a lot of promise for what these magic medicines can do for us. And, again, I'm just humbly grateful to our ancestors and the people who've come before us who knew all of this before they could figure it out under a microscope and write out a chemical symbol. Like they knew that these medicines could heal us and empower us. So if you have any last questions, I can't believe I've talked for almost an hour. Well, of course I can believe I talked for almost an hour. Is what I do. Anyway. All right. So any other question? I'm not sure I understand your question, Cinders. On a hypothetical level, if someone is in purpose, does that mean that everyone with whom he or she is associated, that they are also doing the same? I don't know if I understand that, so maybe try to reword it. Well, if you are curious, if you would like to get some more information on joining me on any one of these retreats, just visit my website, andreapennington.com. Sign up for any one of my free offerings there, and I'll be happy to email you when I am going to be out and about, whether it's a psychedelic event or not. So, for example, I will also be back at the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York. And there I will be hosting over Memorial Day. I always get confused which one is Labor Day and which one is Memorial Day. The first week of September, I will be at Omega Institute, and I will be leading a workshop around post-traumatic growth. So even beyond resilience, which is our innate capacity to bounce back, we have the capacity to use adversity, to use illness and struggle to bounce forward with post-traumatic growth. And that's what we'll be covering at Omega Institute. Absolutely excited to be doing that for Labor Day in the United States this year in 2022. So I'd love to see you there if you'd like to join us. And of course, we can connect there as well. All right. Well, thank you so much for tuning in and sharing your questions. I look forward to hearing how you are processing this information with psychedelics and all of that. If you have more questions or there's a specific substance that you're curious about, let me know, and maybe I'll do a video on it. I do hope that you will tune in again. I will also be doing a reboot of my podcast. So you will start to see me interviewing other people for the Conscious Evolution podcast. And I'm really excited about that because now is the time for us all to use conscious awareness to move forward in our life and to expand and to heal and to grow. And that's what we're all capable of. So super excited to be bringing that to you. So thank you so much for being here. I'm so glad that this was interesting for you and that you stuck with me this far. Please know this, my dear friend, no matter what's going on in your world, you are a gift to this world. So please share your presence with passion. Much love to you, everyone. See you next time. Bye.